to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Husain Haqqani, Director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute, join us to discuss South Asian Muslims and the American experience. Ambassador Haqqani will speak for 10 to 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Ambassador Husain Haqqani.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join all of you today to discuss the South Asian Muslim experience in America. We must understand that when the word Muslim is mentioned in the United States, there is an assumption that somehow it denotes people of Middle Eastern origin. But the world's largest Muslim populations are not in the Middle East. Indonesia, which is in East Asia, is the world's largest Muslim country. Then there is Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, all with large Muslim populations. In fact, even today, 20% of America's Muslims are of South Asia origin, and 35% of those American Muslims who were born outside of the United States come from South Asia. The largest, of course, segment comes from Pakistan, but there are large Muslim populations whose home of origin is Afghanistan, India, or Bangladesh. Now, the South Asian Muslim experience in America actually goes back quite a while ago. There was a very interesting article not long ago, I think in the Atlantic, about somebody who earned the nickname Hot Tamale King in a place in a small town in northeastern Wyoming. This gentleman had come to the United States as a crew member on a ship that sailed from what was then British India. He came from the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and in 1909, he decided that he wanted to stay on in the United States. And he sold tamales. So here was a person of, a Muslim person of what was then the British Indian subcontinent, later on became Pakistan, who ended up in the United States along the West Coast, and then eventually moved inwards into Wyoming and ran a small Mexican cuisine restaurant in northeastern Wyoming. So the trickle of Muslims from South Asia was people like Hot Tamale King, but the real flow started after the independence of British India and the creation of the two countries of Pakistan and India. And Pakistan signed up as an ally of the United States very early on. So that facilitated Pakistani professionals coming to America, either as students or for postgraduate studies. And that is where the real seeds of the large South Asian Muslim diaspora started. By and large, the people who decided to make America their home wanted to be assimilated. So it wasn't unusual to find somebody called Jim Farooqui or Sid Khan, which was essentially an adaptation of their names to what they thought was the way to do it in America. Sid was Shahid when he was born or when he left Pakistan. Jim was Jamshed. And many of them were primarily professionals. If we move forward a little bit, by the 70s and 80s, the diaspora, big South Asian Muslim diaspora started becoming a little wider. The large Muslim population in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh and now Telangana, which had this princely state called Hyderabad, many of its citizens decided that instead of moving to Pakistan, they should move to the United States, especially if they were skilled professionals. And so we have now an interesting South Asian Muslim diaspora, many of whom are professionals or even entrepreneurs. There is Shahid Khan, and some of them are very well known in their respective fields, very successful. There's Shahid Khan, who owns one of the, I think it's an American football team in Jacksonville. He started his career working for General Motors, and he developed some kind of bumper for motor cars, which he patented, and is now a billionaire. Then there is Safi Qureshi, who made his money in IT. There is Frank Islam, whose original name was Shah Islam. He's from India. But he adopted the name of his teacher, who was some. Yet they all maintained their Muslim identity. And here is where the South Asian connection became a little weak, because as the Muslim sort of diaspora generally needed places of worship, places of education for their children, religious education for their children, they had to create a broader connection with the other Muslim communities, and primarily the Muslims of the Middle East. And so mosques started sprouting in various parts of America. But the majority of South Asian Muslims in America essentially wanted to be part of American life while keeping their religion until fairly late. It was the desire to have religious education for children that made a lot of them turn to Islamic centers and mosques that were coming up throughout the United States. As of now, for example, we have 12,000 doctors in America. So America had a shortage of doctors in the 70s and 80s and opened its doors to people with a medical degree from another country, provided they passed an examination here, did their residency, they could practice medicine here. And a lot of people from South Asia took advantage of it. In fact, even today, there are about 52,800 medical doctors, physicians in America who are from India, and 12,000 from Pakistan. The ones from Pakistan are 98% Muslim, and the ones from India also have a sprinkling of Muslims among them. And these doctors, because of the way the immigration policy was structured, had to serve in rural and small communities to be able to be fast-tracked for American citizenship. And many of them volunteered to do that. They still made more money than they would have made back home. They had greater freedom. They liked the life here, but they wanted to retain their culture. The Middle Eastern groups also, I mean, a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims in the United States initially did not intend to bring Middle Eastern politics or even religious fights to North America. Only in the 1980s did this, what we face today as radical Islamism, became a phenomenon. And that became primarily because at that time, the US government was supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and the religious institutions that were being created in North America, mosques, religious schools, Islamic schools, they needed teachers. And the teachers overwhelmingly came from the Middle East. So here, South Asian Islam, which has always been very diverse, for example, the Mughals, who were the last large Muslim empire in India, they had to make a lot of compromises with the majority of the population that remained Hindu. And that resulted in a lot of syncretic practices within Islam, cultural syncretism, where you did not essentially follow the letter, but more the spirit of the faith. Now, the more austere version of Islam that was practiced, say, for example, in Saudi Arabia, what can be called Wahhabi Islam, was the major option available when you wanted to send your child to a Sunday school. And therefore, the children and the younger generation was exposed to a more puritanical version of the faith. as that puritanical version was hijacked by more radical groups, the younger generation had greater chances of being exposed to that. So now so a lot of people had to make a choice of breaking all ties to the structure of the infrastructure of faith that had evolved, or basically accept the practices that their teachers were teaching rather than the ones that their parents had been exposed to. In the aftermath of 9/11, this phenomenon was debated widely in America. The Middle East Forum played an important role also in making Americans aware of the of the radical streak within the Muslim community. But the disorganized community, and by the way, an overwhelming majority of Muslims in America, both of South Asian origin and of other parts or from other parts, are not part of organized religious life in America. But those who were and all ended up being moving in one direction. So the last 2 decades have been decades of argument. It's very interesting. There are many interesting dimensions to the South Asian Muslim diaspora. South Asian Muslims, up until the late 1980s, overwhelmingly voted Republican because they had left countries where there was a streak of socialism, which they wanted to escape. So they all ended up coming here, and as soon as they became citizens and got the right to vote, ended up voting Republican, in many cases being very strongly active within the party organizations, in local Republican organizations. A lot of that started changing after 9/11. The American discourse after 9/11 did not often make a distinction between radical Islamists and regular Muslims. And it was very difficult, to be fair, from an American point of view, to be able to understand another faith's internal conflicts and divisions. And we had also some backlash. And so the Muslim community kind of started becoming more inward, and the South Asian Muslims were not exempt from that. Even now, by the way, I would argue that most South Asian Muslims have assimilated into American life. You have South Asian Muslim comedians on American television because that's what these kids wanted to be. You have an entire generation of IT professionals, and then you have, of course, the physicians and college professors, all of whom retain a Muslim identity as faith, but have predominantly an American culture in their day-to-day life. If you see the women of their families, you wouldn't be able to, in a mall, for example, you wouldn't find them very distinct. Perhaps some of them would cover their head, but they would not otherwise be identifiable as Muslim until they spoke their name or said something else about identifying themselves as Muslim. The post-9/11 environment was very interesting, or I would say disturbing as well. We heard stories about crackdowns on illegal immigrants, but those were not always portrayed to the Muslim community as immigration enforcement. They were presented to it as anti-Muslim act, and some were. There were some children, for example, came up with very funny responses. There is a famous joke in the Muslim community that this child from Bangladesh or of Bangladeshi parents was confronted in a small town school in Tennessee by other children. Children can sometimes be very cruel to each other. And they said, "Why don't you go back to where she came from?" And she turned around and said, "My dad says we can't go back to Connecticut," because this child had never been to Bangladesh. Her home was in Connecticut, and her father had relocated to Tennessee for his work. And so that kind of sort of feeling or sense that maybe our community is under attack led a lot more Muslims to change their politics and also to change their original views of about assimilation And that is what we see happening today. I think that a lot of South Asian Muslims who are in the United States would identify more as Americans than as citizens of the countries of their origin. But if you attend the conventions of organizations that purport to represent them, you will find that there is a very strong undercurrent of trying to organize all Muslims. First of all, portray them all as a monolith, and second, to organize them exclusively around religion, and then also around a certain definition of faith. Islam is the faith of more than 1 billion people around the world. It has many sects and denominations. It has many subcultures, but at a political level, some people want to identify it as a monolith, both within the Muslim community and outside. And so there has been, in my view, the emergence of a communitarian identity which did not exist, say, for example, up until the 80s or even the 90s. And that has been somewhat detrimental to the process of assimilation of America's Muslims of South Asian origin. Right now, I would say that the basic distinction is between the professionals, the college professors, the physicians, the IT professionals, the entrepreneurs, the lawyers, the university educated, and then those who are not that privileged. And I think that while radical ideas can appeal to both, I think that the professionals have a intellectual desire to assimilate and understand that they have moved countries, and therefore they have taken an oath of loyalty to the United States and should remain sort of committed to the idea of becoming Americans. But then there are those who are here and who have not realized the American dream and have a yearning for returning back home. And when they come to the Islamic centers, to the mosques, then that is sometimes translated into more radical ideas. In the last few years, law enforcement has been able to weed out a lot of the radical activists, but the radical ideology, I don't think, has been completely uprooted or diminished. The subcontinent, the biggest group in the subcontinent with a radical Islamist ideology is a group called the Jamaat-e-Islami. It's the analog of the Muslim Brotherhood of the Middle East. And they have built an infrastructure which includes a national organization called the Islamic Circle for North America, parallel to the Islamic Society for North America, which has its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood. And they work in tandem with the Muslim Brotherhood and run Islamic schools, Islamic charities, and Islamic centers that basically focus on the political dimension of Islam rather than the spiritual one. I think that is the layout. Now, as a South Asian Muslim myself, who has been in the United States for 20 years, I would say that the South Asian Muslim experience in America has been one of tremendous diversity. Many of us have differences among ourselves. No two South Asian Muslims are necessarily exactly alike. The Afghans speak Dari and Pashto. The Pakistanis speak Pashto, Punjabi, Baluchi, Sindhi, and Urdu. The Indians likewise have multiple languages. And similarly, culture, cuisine, everything, there are many differences. So the only common factor is the faith. And while that creates opportunities for coming together, it is it has limited utility as a unifier. So a very diverse community spread all over the United States. Each one of the 50 states has a Muslim community, and it has a South Asian Muslim community. Let me just stop here. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions based on what I have said. I just tried to give an overview, and then we will take a deeper dive based on your questions. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions coming in. The first one we have is, since all translations of the Quran are considered to be interpretations, could this explain why South Asian and other moderate Muslims are intimidated to challenge the native Arabic-speaking Islamists on theological issues?
I would answer with a qualified yes. Yes, that is one of the factors. In fact, all non-Arabic speakers tended to be intimidated sometimes. But the fact of the matter is that in the normal life of people, theological argumentation is not a very significant factor. You don't wake up, or not everybody wakes up every morning thinking of what are the theological arguments about X, Y, and Z. Most people want to get on with their lives, make a living for their family, etc., etc. So basically, it is only those who have a yearning to understand theological arguments that end up in the environment in which the Arabic speakers are considered as more knowledgeable, because they have access to the earliest texts, because all the early texts on Islam, including the Holy Book, but also other books and works of reference, are all in Arabic. So people do get intimidated. For the shall I say, the Friday prayer Muslim, the Muslim who attends Friday prayers and only goes for high holidays, they are not easily intimidated. But the ones who do want to take a sort of more theological position and understand and get into this, they find themselves at a disadvantage because of the language.
Understood. Thank you. Can you provide background on Uraj Rahman, the lawyer who threw the Molotov cocktail? And I'm sorry if I had the bad pronunciation on that.
I really have no idea about him per se, but my view would be that he threw the Molotov cocktail not because of Islam, because I'm not sure whether he was even Muslim. One of his partners was. I think that the issue there is more left-wing ideology than it is Islam. But there is a crossover these days all over the world, because as the left or the hard left in the world kind of declined after the fall of communism, in many cases they have adopted as a cause the radical Islamists, because they think that at least they are resisting, quote unquote, American empire. So you find British Trotskyists writing defense for the Taliban, for example, why the Taliban are a force for liberation, which anybody who is not totally sort of drunk on the Kool-Aid of a Trotskyist ideology would find absurd. But I think that the left influence there, or the hard left influence, is more responsible for radicalism than the Islamic influence per se, in some cases.
Understood. So what do you think it would take for an Islamic reformation to arise in the Muslim mosques in America?
Well, for one thing, I think that it would be a question of leadership and of resources. The ideas are all out there now. I think that enough has been written by some scholars on what reform, or what a reformed approach to an Islamic life would be like. The question is, can they compete with the organized structures that already exist? So there are two groups we are talking about that are distinct. One are traditionalists, people who say we need to just follow Islam as it has been handed down to us. They are an obstruction to reform because they think that embracing modernity is somehow turning your back on your faith. These are people who insist on dressing a certain way, saying certain phrases a certain way, etc., etc. But they are not necessarily radical because they do not embrace a political or a politicized version of the faith. Then there are what can be described as the Islamic revivalists. They really believe that Islam is a political ideology, and because it's a political ideology, therefore it has to establish an Islamic state. And if an Islamic state has to be created, it doesn't matter whether you live as a non-Muslim minority as a Muslim minority in an overwhelmingly non-Muslim country, or whether you live as a Muslim in a Muslim country. Everywhere you have to try and create the dominance of Islam. That idea has been actually challenged by a lot of Muslim scholars through Islamic texts, saying that Islam insisted, while Islam's evolution involved empires as a faith, but the Holy Book never describes Islam as the faith of an empire. And so the faith may have created or led to empires, but it is not meant only to be tied to a empire of faith. Second, the very idea that Islam must be dominant everywhere is not only unrealistic, but also contrary to the world that we live in. For example, initially a lot of Islamic, and there's a very good book on it by an Islamic scholar from Iraq who was here in the United States. It's about how Islamic jurisprudence needs to change, because in the old days, either Muslims lived in Muslim empires where the rulers were Muslims, or even when the majority was non-Muslim, it was still the Muslim who was making the laws and the rules. However, now Muslims are protected. Their freedom of religion is protected in non-Muslim countries. And so Muslims have an obligation to extend the same equality to their brethren in other countries. The United Arab Emirates used that as the justification for allowing Jews to resume religious activity in the United Arab Emirates recently, to allow Hindus to build a temple, saying you can't apply 7th century rules to a 21st century life. If Muslims are getting permission to build mosques in Europe, where most people are either Christian or agnostic or atheists, why should Muslims deny people of other faith the same permission? So those debates are and have been taking place. The only problem is getting traction and essentially getting somebody with power behind them, because these are ideas in books. These are ideas that people like me are reading and discussing and debating with others. I run a study circle of other Muslims who and recommend such readings for them so that they understand faith differently. But basically, I do not control a television outlet like Al Jazeera, which only has radical Islamists espousing their version of faith on it. So that's what will change. But let me just say that, knowing the community as well as I do, while every now and then there is reason for pessimism, overall, there are many, many reasons for optimism also, that there are people in the community who will continue to resist the radical ideas as long as they have support of reasonable people outside the community who do not make it and who do not allow this to be made into a us versus them. The moment you do an us versus them, then the us becomes the radicals, because then there's no room for somebody like me. Because then the argument becomes, you know what, you're irrelevant. They are coming for all of us, and you are either their instrument or you're irrelevant from our community's perspective. And in the US, for example, there have been revolts in certain mosques. There was the famous Cleveland Mosque incident way back in 2003, I think, 2002, something like that, where the community just turned around the preacher, turned around and demanded the removal of the preacher, because they said, we come here to pray, not to hear the preacher talk about American imperialism and how bad Israel is.
Well, thank you. Along those lines, unfortunately, we're near the end of our webinar. Can you suggest some books or articles or resources for those who want to learn more about South Asian Muslim communities in the US?
Well, we publish at Hudson Institute a journal called Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. This is an important piece. It's an important journal that has pieces and articles on the entire Muslim community across the world, and it often has interesting pieces on South Asian Muslims as well as Muslims from other parts of the world, and what are the currents of thought, and what are the major issues and debates that are currently taking place amongst them.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Ambassador Haqqani, for speaking with us.
Thanks a lot, and I'm sorry I speak too much, so therefore we didn't get as many questions in, but I've noted all the questions that have been asked on the written thing, and I will try and answer them in my future articles and maybe a future discussion.
Oh, wonderful to hear. Thank you. For our viewers, please be on the lookout for our weekly webinar offerings for next week, coming out over the weekend. And thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.